Okay, so I'm going to, because we're getting a very late start because of that little glitch, I'm going to go through this presentation very, very quickly because I know some of you are on lunch hours, some of you have things to do. Actually, this is causing a glare. So I'm going to go through the presentation very quickly. And then at the end, I'll stop, and people that have to go back to their office or whatever, go back to work, you can leave. And those people that aren't in a hurry, that do have a little bit of time to stick around and talk, can stay on the line and ask questions. But what I think I'm going to do, because we had so many RSVPs and we had that technical glitch, I think there's a lot of people that wanted to participate in this webinar. I think we will run it again on Wednesday, May 30th. So that's the plan. So the plan is I'm going to go through it today very quickly. Then I will go through it. We'll do it again. We'll represent it on Wednesday, May 30th, same time, same place, but with a good link. So let me go ahead and get started. I'm going to introduce myself very quickly. My name is Toni Marsh. I'm the director of the George Washington University Paralegal Studies program, and I'm a professor of paralegal studies. I'm also a lawyer. I've been a lawyer for 26 years, and when I was I really don't practice anymore very much. I do a little bit, but very little. But when I was practicing full-time, I did criminal defense and juvenile law. So at GW, I teach juvenile law, and I teach American jurisprudence, which is just the introductory overview of the law, and I teach legal writing, not all in the same semester. I do it in different semesters. We have a stellar faculty here at GW that teach, that run the range of courses. So I know you didn't log on to hear about the GW faculty, but since you asked about our specialties, one of our professors is the head of litigation and for immigration at the Department of Homeland Security. Our intellectual property professor was the chief of staff to the Commissioner of the United States Patent and Trademark Office. So our international law professor is head of treaties and contracts for the United States Department of Agriculture. So all of our professors, they're adjunct, which means they work full time in real jobs, and they teach here in the evenings, and they're all specialists in their field. So since you asked about that, I thought I'd give you a quick overview of that. So let me go ahead and get started on the presentation. It's called From Airports to Caravans, Paralegals on the Journey to Justice. And I'll also preface this by saying I've been teaching paralegal studies. I've been involved in the paralegal profession for 26 years. And my specialty, what my area of focus in the paralegal world is access to justice. So I study how paralegals can help increase access to justice for generally underserved people. There are, throughout the United States and throughout the world, lawyer shortages. Now, probably doesn't surprise you to hear that in many African nations and many Eastern European nations, there are severe lawyer shortages. But also in rural America and in rural United States, in almost every state in the United States, there are lawyer shortages, believe it or not. If you go into the big cities, or you go to a place like Washington, D.C., we've got more lawyers than you could possibly imagine. But if you go to places like rural Nebraska, South Dakota, Idaho, Iowa, there are entire counties that don't have a single lawyer. And when you have these crisis situations, or even personal crises, like a person gets a DUI, or a person's a victim of domestic violence, a person is arrested wrongfully, if you don't have access to a lawyer, a small thing can turn into a huge problem. It can turn into a life-changing event. So I study how paralegals can help to increase access to justice among underserved people. So that's me, by the way, Toni Marsh. I'm the director of the GW Paralegal Studies program. So as I said, throughout the world and throughout the U.S., paralegals serve the underserved. The photos that you'll see here, some of the photos that you see are from Tanzania, where I do a lot of work. So I go to Tanzania frequently. I work with paralegals there. I designed the paralegal curriculum for the nation of Tanzania, and I designed the first formal paralegal education program in the nation of Tanzania, where paralegals are so crucial. So paralegals work with the underserved, and they provide a lot of services to these people that, in the absence of lawyers. So what exactly can paralegals do in a legal setting? Paralegals can do a lot. They can do almost everything. So when you think about the whole, universe of legal services or legal jobs that need to be done, paralegals can do most of them, except for a very small number of things, which I'll get to in the next slide. But specifically, what kinds of things do paralegals do frequently? Conduct research. They can draft memos, so they draft all kinds of documents. So they can draft legal briefs, all kinds of legal filings, also business filings, and communications with clients and courts. They can interview witnesses. They can interview parties. What they do a lot of is managing documents, again, drafting those documents, but not only researching and drafting them, but also filing them, managing them, tracking them, making sure that they go to the right place, making sure you have the right number of copies and that they get to the right people. And in a lot of law firms and law offices, the paralegals really drive the technology. They really handle the technology. The paralegals will do things in trials like they'll handle all of the logistics. They'll handle what they call the war room at a trial. So if you're involved in a big crisis litigation situation, they'll handle the hotel rooms, the technology. They'll make sure there's cables. They'll handle the exhibits. They'll keep all of that in order. They'll line up the witnesses and the parties and make sure everybody knows where they're supposed to be. So there's many, many, many things that they can do, almost unlimited. So it's easier to say what paralegals can't do, because what they can do is so vast. So what they can't do is paralegals can't sign legal documents. So if you've got a complaint that you're filing in a court, or a brief, or a writ of habeas corpus, or an answer to a complaint, paralegals can't sign those things. They can draft them, but they can't be the one to sign them. A lawyer has to sign any legal document that's filed with a court. A paralegal can't accept cases on behalf of a lawyer. They can't set fees for cases. They can't advocate in court. So they can't be the actual person who's standing up there asking questions of a client, of a witness or a party, arguing to a judge. They can't be the actual person who's up there doing that arguing. They can be in the courtroom, and as I said earlier, they can manage all of those tasks, but they just can't be the one advocating. Although in many administrative hearings, actually, paralegals can advocate. So that, even that small exception, you can sort of chip away at that. They can't take depositions. And then the big thing that paralegals can't do is they can't give legal advice. So what do I mean by give legal advice? What is legal advice? Legal advice is giving legal advice is when you exercise independent judgment over a set of facts and circumstances so as to alter the legal position of a layperson. So let me give you an example of that. Let's say, and this is a real case that I tried a long time ago, let's say that a person is walking in a grocery store and they're walking along, they don't see anything in the aisle, everything looks fine, but suddenly out of nowhere their feet fly out from under them, they land on their two hands, they land on the ground with their two hands, they break both wrists, and when they stand up, their hands are sort of coated in oil, and there's little shards of glass in her, and this is a woman, in her palms. Now, what does this tell you? This tells you that somebody broke a bottle of oil on the floor, right? There was oil on the floor. It was in a glass bottle. That's where the little glass shards came from. Somebody cleaned that oil, but didn't clean it very well, right? You know that the person cleaned it because our client, the woman walking in the grocery store, you know that somebody cleaned it because our client, the woman in the grocery store, didn't see a bottle, didn't see a puddle, saw nothing. So somebody cleaned that oil but didn't clean it well. Now, what does that tell you further? It tells you that the store knew about the spill and took responsibility for the spill by cleaning by cleaning the spill, but didn't do it right. So what we have here is a clear case of negligence. Now, any paralegal in the world could tell you that. Any paralegal in the world can look at those facts and say, I can tell you from the oil on her palms and the shards on her palms that there was a broken bottle of oil. I can tell you that from the fact that she didn't see it, she didn't see anything, that somebody cleaned that oil. It was likely somebody from the store, because who else would have gone in and cleaned up the oil, which means that the store had noticed but didn't do it well, which means the store is going to be liable. Now, let's say that further, an insurance adjuster finds this woman who's now got the 2 broken wrists. We're talking about major damages here, right? She's got missed work, she's got medical bills, pain and suffering. She's going to have to hire somebody to clean her house and drive her around. She can't use her hands. So we're talking about big damages here, right? Somebody from the insurance company says, look, we will pay all of your medical expenses if you'll sign this waiver. Now, should she sign the waiver? Again, any paralegal in the world can tell you, no, she shouldn't sign the waiver, right? She's got a good case here. We got liability on the part of the store. This is a big store. It's, let's say it's Whole Foods or something. So we've got a store that's got deep pockets that can really pay those damages. We've got liability. We've got big damages on her part. She should not sign that waiver. She's got a good lawsuit. You have looked at a set of facts and circumstances. You've exercised your independent judgment. And if you tell this woman, no, don't sign that waiver, you got a great lawsuit, you're altering her legal position. So that is a classic example of giving legal advice, right? So paralegals, non-lawyers cannot give legal advice. The paralegal can tell the lawyer, hey, look, we got a great case here. You should tell this woman not to sign the waiver. The paralegal can consult with the lawyer and go back and tell the woman not to sign the waiver, but to exercise your own judgment, to alter over a set of facts and circumstances, to alter the legal position of a layperson. That is practicing law, and paralegals cannot do that. All right, so now let's look at some. And let me just take that one step further. As long as the paralegal doesn't do these things that I just told you, these signing legal documents, accepting cases, setting fees, advocating in court, taking depositions, or giving legal advice, and then further talk about what's legal advice. As long as the paralegal doesn't do that, they're on good ground. They're on safe ground. So the paralegal can do everything else, a lot of other things, and all of those other things that we are talking about. So let me, I just have some notes here, and I want to be sure that I don't skip anything. So I want to open up my notes over here on the side. Okay, so let's skip that there. Anyway, all right, here we go. So let's talk about the travel ban. You all remember back in January, in fact, it was January 28th, right after Trump was inaugurated, a few days after Trump was inaugurated, one of the first things that he did was signed an executive order prohibiting travelers from 7 predominantly Muslim countries: Iraq, Syria, Somalia, Iran, Yemen, Sudan, and Libya. So he came out and said explicitly, this is not a Muslim ban, but he prohibited travelers from 7 majority Muslim countries, and further said that as they reviewed this executive order, they were going to allow people from these countries who were members of what he called religious minorities to enter from those countries. Well, it just so happens that all of the religious minorities in those countries, are the predominant group of religious minorities in those countries, are Christians. And he actually explicitly said, well, we're going to give priority to Christians. He framed it as them being persecuted minorities, but it's interesting that what he was doing was banning the Muslim travelers, but allowing the Christians in. He said it wasn't based in religion, but everybody else thought it was. Certainly all of the legal minds thought that it was. So This happens on Friday, January 28th. He signs the executive order. By Saturday, actually by Friday night, but really by Saturday, protesters, thousands and thousands of protesters were descending on these airports. And by the way, there were airports all over the country was where these crises were happening, because as he banned the travelers, people were being stopped at the airport. People that were coming in from these countries were being held right at the airport. Other people were not being allowed to board their flights on the other end in those airports, but we're not even really focusing right now on the international airport. But there were people who were in transit as this executive order took effect, and these were the people that were being stopped, were being held, actually detained at the airports. And so, the border airport, the coastal airports were the ones that were the hardest hit. So we were looking at LAX, we were looking at San Francisco, JFK in New York, Dulles here in Washington, but even others, Houston, Denver was hit hard, Detroit was hit hard. So these airports all over the country, people were literally being detained or being arrested, or not arrested, but being detained at those airports. And these were legitimate travelers. These were people with travel documents, with visas. These were legitimate travelers, but anybody coming over from those countries, they were being detained at the airports. So by that evening, thousands of protesters were descending on those airports, and lawyers and paralegals were rushing into those airports and were setting up shop right in the airports. So you had lawyers set up. These pictures are kind of small, so this format sort of shrinks the PowerPoint. It's kind of hard to see the pictures. But you had lawyers sitting on the floor. You had groups of lawyers and paralegals camped out on the floors of these airports with their laptops and their books and their phones, and signs, handwritten signs saying, "Free legal help, free translation, are you being detained? Do you know somebody who's been detained? There were even signs that said things like, have you noticed anything unusual on your flight? Did you see anything disturbing on your flight?" So they were just holding up these signs, meeting with people, and giving them advice and counsel right there at the airport. By Saturday night, the ACLU was in court, was in federal court in Virginia, Northern Virginia, and were getting orders from the federal court. They're staying this travel ban or Muslim ban, whatever you call it, but staying the ban, right? And then the ACLU ended up taking these cases to court, as you know. Following that crazy, hectic weekend, they were filing courts and amicus briefs, and they were filing in courts all over the country, and they were getting this ban stayed and eventually overturned. So, but paralegals were there right alongside the lawyers. They were doing intake, they were doing research, they were physically just calming people, just keeping people, but they were managing the process at the airport so that the lawyers who were sitting there trying to do the legal work, the counseling and giving legal advice and drafting these documents, writs of habeas corpus, and all of these documents that were being filed in the federal court trying to get these people released, the people who were being detained. First, they were doing two things. One is they were dealing with the people who were actually being detained at the airport, and the other thing is they were trying to get this ban overturned. So one was they were dealing with the immediate problem of people being detained, and then the other thing is they were trying to get this whole crazy executive order overturned, or stayed, at the very least, to get it stayed. So the paralegals were the ones that were managing these people. They were doing translation, they were doing the research, they were doing all of the background, they were filing, they were assisting what they were doing the running, while the lawyers were doing the giving legal advice, which of course the paralegals can't do, and were signing these documents and getting them filed in the courts. The other place or the other crisis point where we've seen paralegals having a major impact is what is in the caravan. And again, it's funny what you call these things is even politically charged. So some people, the last event we were talking about, some people called it a Muslim ban, some people called it a travel ban, of course, the Trump administration was calling it, I think, an immigration or an illegal immigration ban or something like that. So, you give these things names, and often those names are politically fraught. So you probably heard it called the migrant caravan. That's how they were referring to it in the media. And of course, that's because that's how the Trump administration was referring to it. And that's the name that caught on. But technically, it really wasn't a migrant caravan. These were not people that were just like coming to America in search of a better life, or in search of work, or just trying to join their families because they wanted to be in America. I mean, these were not people that were voluntarily coming to America because they just thought it would be nice to be in America, right? These are actual refugees who are fleeing violence and persecution. And there is a difference, right? So the other thing is the people in this caravan were not in any way seeking to enter the country illegally. They were not trying to sneak in. They were not trying to scam or game the laws or game the system. They were seeking refuge as legitimate international refugees. Throughout American history, we have accepted refugees. There are laws that govern how we accept, receive, and process refugees. If a refugee comes to the border of America, they are supposed to be seen, their story is supposed to be heard by an American immigration official. But that was not happening, and it was not happening in this instance. Now, another thing to know about this refugee caravan is that this is not the first one. This wasn't like a new thing, and it wasn't by any means the biggest one that the United States has ever experienced. So these refugee caravans happen all the time. They're an annual event, usually every year around Easter time. Activists, immigration activists, and human rights activists will organize these caravans of refugees and move them up from Central America into North America. And they do it, they organize these people into caravans mainly for their protection. Because as you might imagine, people traveling, I'm sure you know, people traveling from Central America up into North America seeking refuge are quite vulnerable. And they fall victim to all kinds of just flat out violence, bandits, muggers, rapists, robbers, thieves, killers. They fall victim to con men who say they're going to move them through and just take their money. There have been horrific events where people have been loaded into the backs of trucks and left to die of heat exposure in the desert. So people that are traveling up through Central America and into North America are very vulnerable. And so the human rights activists typically will organize these people into caravans for their own protection, for their own safety. I think a side effect of it and a side potential benefit of it up until this year was that having them in these caravans would raise awareness of the plight of these people and, show the sheer numbers of people that needed to seek refuge from violence and persecution in their home countries. And, when you read these stories, we're not talking about like, oh, I want to leave because I just, I can't get a good job here and I want to get a better job in America. We're talking about people that are being, pulled into gangs, young men. I mean, there's countless stories. A young man doesn't want to join the local cartel, but the cartel wants him. So they come into his house, they rape his mother, they rape his sister. They say, if he doesn't join, this is going to go on every night. They cut off people's hands. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that they're fleeing, not, a slow job market. So they organize into this caravan, and this particular one, because Trump was president and he decided to make immigration a major issue, he started tweeting about this particular caravan and brought all kinds of attention to it. So this caravan became a symbol. It became politically fraught. It became a big deal. Whereas normally they really are not all that big they're not that unusual. They're a big deal. They're not that unusual. And as I said, this particular one wasn't even one of the biggest ones. Ones in the past have been much bigger. Typically, another misconception was that these people were all coming from Mexico. In fact, they were not. They were coming from Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, and they were seeking refuge in Mexico. So many of them, when the caravan started out, there were 1,200 people in it. By the time they reached the U.S. border, there were only 150 people. So that many people, over 1,000 people, had dropped off along the way. Some of them stopped in Mexico because compared to what they were living in Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador, Mexico was a better alternative. So many of them sought refuge in Mexico. Some of them, of course, dropped out and went back home. They got sick, they got whatever. And only about 150 ultimately made it to the U.S. border. But again, there were paralegals organizing this, and one of the primary organizers of this particular caravan and others is a paralegal named Alex Mensing. So he was with the University of San Francisco School of Law Immigration and Deportation Defense Clinic. That's a long name. But he was he was a paralegal there at that clinic. And he's now with an organization called Pueblos Sin Fronteras. And he is one of the people who organized and accompanied the caravan up. So again, paralegals in these situations do things. They do similar things to what was happening in the airport. They were fielding calls. They were filing documents. They were counseling. They were translating. And they were taking care of people along the way. When they got to the U.S. border and they met with so much resistance, and not only that, but the U.S. Border Patrol agents at the border where this caravan came in weren't even following usual North American or United States immigration procedures, refugee procedures. So there are certain procedures that we're obligated by law to follow, and the border agents were not doing those things. So they weren't receiving these refugees. They weren't hearing them as they are legally obligated to do, but rather they were turning them over to the Mexican police and to Mexican border agents, which is not the legally sanctioned procedure. So the paralegals in this case were helping to draft the documents, and they were helping to raise awareness about these procedures. They were doing the research to find out what the procedures were supposed to be and things like that. So they were doing a lot of that background and support work so that the lawyers that were accompanying these people at the border were able to get their documents filed and get these people, get them hearings, and get some of them out of detentions. Because again, just like at the airports, when the migrants, when the refugees reached the U.S. border, some of them were actually being detained. So paralegals were working to help get those people out of detention. Okay. So I want to talk to you also, and we only have very, very short time left because we started late. I'm going to talk to you about a couple of paralegals in particular who have done a lot to serve the other underserved and who have done a lot to, again, close that gap in access to justice. So Heather Heyer, you may have heard of Heather Heyer. She was back in August in Charlottesville, Virginia. There was the neo-Nazi KKK rally where they called it Unite the Right rally, and so they were protesting, and the Unite the Right KKK Nazi people were protesting, demonstrating in the streets of Charlottesville. Heather Heyer was a paralegal at a law firm in Charlottesville called the Miller Law Group, and they served. That law firm was specifically there to serve underserved people. They were there to serve individuals. So they do mostly bankruptcy, they do debt relief, they do landlord-tenant law, they do small civil matters. They're really there to serve underserved individuals. And that's what Heather did at this firm. She was actually a bankruptcy paralegal, so she was doing a lot of work with individuals who were, facing crises in their lives. So she saw this injustice going on, she saw this hate on the streets of Charlottesville, and she went out to protest. And then one of the Nazi demonstrators drove his car into the crowd and ended up murdering Heather. So Heather was killed. She lived her life serving the underserved and bringing justice to the underserved, and then she died fighting Nazis, which is really quite a legacy. Interestingly, if you remember the thing that sparked those rallies in Charlottesville was the city of Charlottesville looking to remove some of those Confederate statues. And right outside of the statue, somebody posted a sign calling it the Higher Memorial Park. Heather's mother went on to speak all over the country. She spoke at the VMA award shows. She was on the Ellen Show. She's been profiled in the New York Times. She won the Muhammad Ali Humanitarian Award. And just this past weekend, GW, our Paralegal Studies program, we inducted Heather into the National Paralegal Hall, the National Paralegal Honor Society. And Heather's mother, Susan Bro, who you see on the screen here, came to our commencement ceremony and spoke there and received the award on behalf of her daughter. So that was a pretty moving moment. And then you may have heard of Erin Brockovich. She was the movie with Julia Roberts. Erin Brockovich was a paralegal who was working at a law firm in California when citizens of a small town in California, Hinckley, California, were getting tumors and were getting cancer and brain damage at a disproportionate rate. It was Erin Brockovich who went out and did the research and did the investigation and discovered that Pacific Gas and Electric was using this chemical in their cooling towers to prevent corrosion inside the cooling towers. It's called chromium-6. And then they were dumping that wastewater into unlined ponds, and the water was seeping into the groundwater, and people in that community were getting cancer and birth defects at a disproportionate rate. And it was Erin who went out and did the research, the investigation, and really, pushed that case through, eventually getting a $333 million settlement for the people of that town. Erin Brockovich is still an environmental consultant and a legal consultant, so she's still a paralegal. She's not a lawyer, but people write to her. Thousands of people write to her every year. They'll send her boxes of documents saying, "I've got this issue in my town. Here's this thing going on, whatever it is." And Erin and her staff will go through those files. They do the legal, the scientific, and the factual research. They figure out which cases are legit. And then they'll bring those cases to the law firms who will then prosecute those cases. One of my alumni, a young man named Sean Goodfriend, did work for Erin Brockovich. He's now in law school, but he worked for her for a couple of years. He was the one, as a paralegal, he was the one who did the legal, the scientific, and the factual research, and that would pull those teams together to eventually take on those cases. So another instance of paralegals doing some great work. In Tanzania, where I said I do a lot of work, paralegals really do provide, they are the only point of access to justice for the vast majority of citizens in Tanzania. I don't have time to go into detail about the kind of work they do there, but what you're looking at on the screen here is a paralegal clinic in the Serengeti. And as you can see, it's just a little concrete structure. There's no glass in the windows. There's no electricity, no plumbing. The roads aren't paved. They're very rudimentary structures. They're staffed by local people who become the town paralegals and receive support from NGOs and national organizations and sometimes the governments of other countries. But they provide access to justice to Tanzanian citizens. And I believe, that's it. So this is our information about the GW Paralegal Program. If you're at all interested, and I know a lot of you are not, I know you just joined because you wanted to learn about this thing. But if you're interested, this is us, and we are accepting applications for fall, and that's it. That's the end of my presentation. I was hoping to wrap it up a little earlier so we'd have some time for questions. But I am done talking now, and I'm happy to take your questions. So what you can do if you've got a question is you can just unmute yourself. If you look at the screen here, you'll see your name, and next to your name you see a little red microphone with a line through it. Just click on that thing, and you can unmute yourself and you can ask questions. And those of you who have to get back to work because it's 1 o'clock, you're welcome to sign off now, and you can view the recording later. I think we send this recording to everybody who registered, and we'll also post it on our website. Did anyone have any questions, or do you have any trouble unmuting yourselves? I guess not. Okay, well, that then I guess we'll go ahead and sign off. And if you end up having, if you decide that you do have some questions later or you'd like to discuss this, I just realized I did not put, let me see, I'm going to write my email address on the board here. So I'm Tony Marsh, and my phone number is 202-510-4163, and my email address is marsht01@gwu.edu, and you are more than welcome to call or email me if you have any questions about this presentation, or if you have questions about the paralegal program at GW or the paralegal profession in general. I'd be happy to answer your questions. So if anybody's got any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Otherwise, I'm just going to go ahead and sign off. Thank you for your attention. It's been wonderful to be here today. Thank you for your perseverance in finding this in finding this site, and I look forward to talking to you soon. Bye-bye.